I'm currently distributing. Was anyone here, I'm gonna pass this around. So this is the seating chart. And if you're not on here, please add your name to that chart. If you are doing the writing requirement in this class, please put an asterisk by your name on the attendance sheet that's circulating. You can always change your mind. You know, as you go through, you just say, well, I don't want to do it now. That's fine with me. The writing requirement operates sort of independently of this course. That's the way I've understood it for a long time. So it doesn't affect your grade in this course. It's not part of the requirements for this course. In other words, there's an independent writing requirement for graduation, as I understand it, and I have to sign off on it. As I told you, I'm basically going to make structural suggestions if need be, and you know, on your initial draft, and then I will you'll presumably correct based on whatever suggestions, if any, that I have, and then return your final draft to me. On April 21 as per our class schedule. Okay, I'm going to try to do this as efficiently as possible. I think what I'm going to do is reserve time at the end of the class to discuss your presentation topics, who's on your team, and when you'd like to actually make a presentation. There are a couple of there's several spots actually where we can double up and do two on one date. Obviously, we can't do that when we have a guest discussing. I don't know whether you guys have a copy of the updated class schedule. I'm not certain whether my assistant sent that to you guys or not. It's on Blackboard. Did she update it today?
It has multiple guest discussants and their titles and stuff.
Did it add Carlos Hernandez? Did it show that?
Yeah.
Great, okay, so it's completely updated, so you have it. All right, gem of the day today. I don't know why this happened to me. I've been practicing law for probably 6-7 years. When I got hired by two partners in a 14-person partnership, they wanted to form their own firm. So they were leaving one firm. It was like a partnership divorce, right? And I mean, I'm getting calls. Like, I remember New Year's Eve, literally 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, from these lawyers, because it seems like one showed up at the firm in the middle of the night and started hauling out client boxes, and it just turned into a nightmare. And it reminded me of why I never wanted to be a divorce lawyer, except this is worse. But you know, I did it the one time, and then before long, I had like 7 cases, and they're relatively lucrative, where I was either, you know, working with the firm someone was leaving, or working with the people leaving the firm. And there are a lot of things, obviously, you have to balance, like, you know, how do you give notice to clients? Does the law firm give the notice, or can I give the notice as the lawyer leaving? Do I have to give the notice to the firm before I give notice to my clients? If I'm the only expert at that firm in a certain field, then presumably the clients would go with me. You get kind of complicated. So I just want to acquaint you with this, since I'm not sure you will hear this any other place. I mean, it might not make it to whatever ethics outline you have when you take the ethics portion of the bar exam. But December 4th, last month, the ABA Standing Committee on Ethics and Professional Responsibility came out with Formal Opinion 489, which deals with the ethical obligations attorneys have when they switch law firms. That could be leaving a law firm and forming your own firm, right? That's switching firms. or joining some existing firm. Especially, according to the drafters, because attorneys are more mobile in their careers than ever before. So in the 10 years I practiced, I made a switch. And many lawyers do. It's gotten to be relatively uncommon for people to join a firm and never leave. And basically, just to summarize, the ethical obligations, including providing the firm with enough notice of the departure to notify clients, working together to ensure an orderly and timely transition of client files, and returning firm property. Firms should have written policies on this, but very often they don't. Ethical obligations include representing a client diligently, which means informing the client promptly of the job change. The ABA model rules say departing lawyers don't have to wait to inform clients so long as the firm is notified at the same time. Some states like Florida require the attorney and the firm the attorney's leaving to try to negotiate a joint client communication before notifying clients. If that fails, the attorney can unilaterally reach out to existing clients. And it makes the really important point, which the lawyers that I first represented all those years ago didn't really get. Clients are not property. So firms and lawyers on the move can't divide them up. Clients decide who will represent them going forward when a lawyer changes firms. Rule 5.1 of the rules say the firm has a duty to make sure there's a, quote, orderly transition, which has become a rule of sort of a technical term regarding ethics obligation. Orderly transition, a term of art. It includes making sure client files are up to date and that a departing lawyer respects the duty of confidentiality for the clients that are left behind. This means returning or deleting all confidential information in your possession. A departing lawyer can keep client names and contact info for purposes of conflicts checks at the new firm. Firms can have employment agreements requiring attorneys to provide reasonable notices of job changes, but those under 5.6, those agreements cannot be used to coerce or punish a lawyer for leaving the firm. And the last thing I thought was really interesting, because I didn't know this, firms also cannot refuse departing lawyers access to adequate firm resources needed to competently represent the client during the transition period. That can include assistance of support staff and access to emails and files. So these ABA formal opinions carry a lot of weight. They're not law, but they carry a lot of weight with bar associations and with courts. What would they go to? You know, they can often, both ethics rules and ABA opinions help form the standard of care applicable to us as lawyers. Okay, so that's the gem of the day today. So what I want to do before we have our before we just sort of sit down and develop our teams and topics, is to quickly take you through, as the class schedule indicates, my very brief article on, I'm just going to go to the highlights, my article on, I guess it's like a summary of the securities law you need to know to be a lawyer for entrepreneurs, right? And I say that because when you think about it, if you're really there are different types of securities lawyers, right? You can be a securities lawyer who never files anything. Basically, you're a securities litigator. So that's one area of securities law. In other words, investors lose money because the stock wasn't registered or because fraud was committed in the offer and sale of that stock. And the securities litigator either brings an individual action on your behalf or brings a class action against everybody involved, including the company, its officers and directors, and perhaps its financial advisors, its investment bankers. That's one area of securities law. Another area would be you're representing a publicly held company, so you're dealing with, filing disclosure reports on a quarterly basis and making sure the company's in compliance with its listing obligations, this should be a new term for virtually all of you, its listing obligations on the exchange where the stock is traded, right? So assuming Brown-Forman is traded on the New York Stock Exchange, certainly Humana is, Yum Brands, we've got, I read the other day, 16 publicly held companies in Louisville, which is a pretty good number for a town of around 1 million people. 16 publicly held companies. I think 5 have over $1 billion in revenue. I was sort of surprised to hear that. I think it's Texas Roadhouse is like 3rd in revenue. I mean, it's bigger than Churchill Downs. Who would have thought? A local guy just started that after I got here 20 years plus ago. So, you know, it's one of the top 3, 4 publicly held companies in the state of Kentucky. Huge revenues. Anyway, we've got 3 or 4 really big ones. Texas Roadhouse, got Humana, Brown-Forman, Churchill Downs. Those are the big ones, Texas Roadhouse. And if you're working with those kind of companies, you know, there's one guy who was in my class early on who went to Frost Brown Todd, and he wasn't a great student, but he was very articulate and very, very diligent. And he went with Frost Brown Todd and helped with the Texas Roadhouse. Maybe Bill Strench can talk about that when he's here next week. Because Bill Strench was the lawyer that conducted the initial private placement. So you can imagine Texas Roadhouse, if you were already practicing law 20 years ago, which seems like a long time, but you know, not really, and maybe it's 15, 20 years ago. So you get the client just needs to raise a little bit of money to get going. He's already got a business plan. He wants to move into the Outback Steakhouse industry, right? Which was very competitive. At that point in time, 15, 20 years ago, nobody would have thought about, you know, trying to compete against Outback. In fact, there was a queue to get an Outback franchise, a really long queue. And because there's a long queue, that means there's a lot of demand, so that means that the Outback owners could increase franchising fees really high. So you pay a fee just to get the franchise. That fee could be $500,000, it could be $1 million. That's before you actually build the buildings and buy the equipment and start hiring people. But this guy decides to go just dive right in. And now he's got a company with $1 billion in revenues. Well, but this guy, my student, decides to leave. So there's a private placement, then there's another private placement, then another private placement, and ultimately there's a public offering. And when they went public, the client hired my former student to go out there and work. Initially, as a lawyer. It's really interesting. But within, I think, 2 years, he'd switched out of being a lawyer there into being an international business development guy, going all over the country and the world looking for locations, looking for franchisees that would you know, set up steakhouses. And I think he's had a blast. He's had a really fulfilling career so far. But in the beginning, he was doing the kind of securities work that got me off on this tangent, which is basically filing, you know, once you're public, you got to file quarterly disclosures. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes, but life's now in a fishbowl, and you have to reveal things you probably wouldn't ordinarily want to reveal to your competitors, and to the marketplace. But you got to do it, right? So that's sort of the price for going into the public markets for investments. So, and then there's the third kind of lawyer, which I really sort of wanted to be, which is to be a lawyer where small businesses know you're going to deliver high quality services at a reasonable price, and you're going to help them, in effect, become successful businesses. And the first step in that is to figure out ways to get capital into the new firm. As we said last time, capital is the blood. It's what circulates in the business to make it work. And without it, the best business plan of all won't help you. You got to have capital. Again, we'll talk about that more. So what would I do? What would be my primary function besides giving them general my own wisdom, limited though it might be in the world of business, the more you're out there practicing and meeting people and talking to people, the more business acumen you develop. You start spotting what's fraudulent, what's not, what's normal and what isn't normal. It just takes experience being out there talking to people. I may have told you this already, but did we talk about advanced finder's fees in this class? So I had a great client who was going, the client I told you, the development nursing home chain. At some point, those two guys were decided to buy a property. They were looking for a property in the Atlanta area, and they found it. Then they were looking for money. Their banks wouldn't loan them any money. So they're finders that actually, and these are legitimate characters usually, finders who for a commission will help your client find bank loans. And this particular, let's call it Acme company, Acme is a finder. So Acme told my clients if for a check, they'd find a loan, it's a fairly sizable loan, for, I don't know, $5 million. And for that, they would take $50,000 as a finder's fee, $25,000 of which would be payable up front, and the other $25,000 would be paid at closing. Well, so it was my first time dealing with that. And so they told me about it. I said, well, don't do anything yet. Let me give this some thought. So give this some thought means talking to a more senior lawyer who may have had some exposure to this. And sure enough, I talked to my partner, Mike Rediker, who says, advanced fee loan schemes are a pretty well-known scam. I said, what do you mean scam? If I go back to my client and tell him to forget it, he's going to think I cost him a $4 or $5 million loan. Well, why don't you just call the Georgia Securities Commission? So that's exactly what I did. And it turns out this Acme's principals, they'd been in trouble with Georgia securities regulators for years. So they were unsavory at best. And later on I talked to Mike about it. He says that's not the way, and this is extra legal, that's not the way business is done in this area. Finders help you find real estate. Finders help you find businesses. They help you find loans. That's legitimate, but they normally take their fee out of sales proceeds or loan proceeds at the closing. They don't take their fees in advance of doing the work. That's very uncommon, at least it was. So that's why it's really important not to be the lone wolf. If you're going to be a business lawyer, you need to be talking to people all the time to familiarize yourself with what's common and what's not common. Because whenever something's not common, that should raise some red flags for you. And all a red flag means is puts you on notice to make further inquiry about it. Okay, so three types: the securities litigator, the public company lawyer, and the lawyer who works for new businesses, for entrepreneurs, people starting a business, and people who want to grow their business. So you got to learn surely the sort of the outline of the law, but basically you got to change your whole perspective and stop thinking. Litigators think, okay, I'm going to represent this guy once, I'm going to get as much money as I can, I'm on to the next case. The company lawyer has a fixed client, right? He or she's there. The entrepreneurial lawyer is actually trying to develop, 20, 30 clients that he can help or she can help make grow. So it's much broader. They're not one, they're lifetime, as I said last time. Okay, so if you're an entrepreneurial lawyer, the main thing you're going to need to know is how do I get this business set up? How do I draft articles of incorporation, bylaws, get an employee identification number from the tax authorities, and get this thing, any necessary licenses. Just the usual stuff we study in corporate law, but the biggest issue is how do you get the capital for this client? What exemptions do you use? So I'm just going to I'm going to go over this brief outline. It's a very practical one. You've got this handout, which if you had me before, you probably have a copy. But this I just redid it last fall, so take a copy of that. But this is from my regulatory vortex article. That's what I'm going to be talking about. So what does securities law do? They have two main purposes. One is to require formal disclosure through this process we call registration, filing a registration statement with the SEC. Okay? So the 33 Act, Securities Act of 1933, requires formal disclosure through registration of all offers and sales of securities. And why did that happen? That's what my securities law course will talk about a great deal more in more depth. But think about it. You're getting disclosure in relatively comparative formats of all companies who are publicly traded. So certainly it makes those in a given industry fully comparable, comparable. What's the other advantage? Because some people literally will say, oh, it's just filing more paperwork with the government. How horrible. But that's really a snap judgment that I could make, but it's absolutely wrong. Why? Because when you, as a securities lawyer, help the company fill out those forms, you've got fiduciary duties as the corporate agent, right, as an employee, to do it competently, or you lose your license. At least you put your license at risk. And you put yourself at risk monetarily if you get sued for malpractice. So you're trying to do a competent job. And standards of competence have evolved. What do securities lawyers do in preparing these disclosure documents? Their CLE program's just chock full of things you're supposed to be thinking about when you prepare those documents. And it's not that complicated. It's just you have a professional responsibility. You're not typically the master servant. You're not the servant and the corporate principal is the master. You're an independent professional and you're expected to exercise independent professional judgment. Just like a patent lawyer, tax lawyer. They can't just make it up. They're supposed to look at a patent application and tell you whether they believe it's patentable. They're not supposed to guess. They're supposed to do a record search, a patent search. They're supposed to be real familiar with this notion of uniqueness, and how unique this particular product or service is. So that's one step. So that means some sort of competently, provided document, the system works, will get filed. But what else does it do? It forces the company to write down stuff, right? Which has huge evidentiary value down the line if investors or regulatory agencies come after this company. It's not the time to lie, There are times when we all need to tell white lies. But when you're filing the lie with a federal regulatory agency, they've got you. So what does that do? That makes the company more careful, already more careful because it's had to hire an attorney to help it do this stuff. So you get a double whammy. What's the other whammy? The federal agency might actually review the document and compare it with others you filed before. There's that risk. And last but not least, believe it or not, these documents get read. If I buy 1,000 shares of Facebook or 100 shares of Facebook, I'm not going to go and read all its public filings. Why not? I don't feel like it. I don't have time. It's boring. But there are lots of people out there who are trained analysts who read that stuff. Financial journalists read that stuff. And they summarize it, and they highlight problem areas. And those stories end up in the Wall Street Journal or Forbes, which I might read. And if I read a negative article about Facebook, I might not buy. If I read a positive article, I might. So all that information, which is like another file document, it actually gets digested and ends up being part of the stock's price because it shapes supply and demand. And all the documents that are filed, pretty much all the documents filed with the SEC are functionally searchable. It's been a technological, evolution there. It's been going on and still is. So again, what's the last reason for requiring disclosure in advance? Well, it's not only to inform the market, but it's to make sure people get protected before the money's gone, right? In other words, if you have to file a formal document before you even offer the securities, then there's a chance a regulator will look at it before the securities are offered and sold, and say, stop. The Securities Division of the Department of Banking and Finance here in Kentucky has stop order authority. It can stop an offering in its tracks if it's fraudulent, if it thinks it's fraudulent, or it thinks it's not being sold through compliance with the exemptions from registration. 2 grounds again. So we got first, registration, which is advanced disclosure. That's what that means. What's the second prong of securities regulation? That's it. Second one, to prevent fraud. You think, well, Professor, when you sell a lot of securities, if somebody commits fraud, the buyer who's defrauded can pull out common law fraud. That's true, and go after the perpetrator. You can go after the issuer and the people who lied on behalf of the issuer. That's right. So what's the need for the disclosure in advance? Because practice and experience show you that when the investor parts with the money, it is typically gone. You aren't going to find it. Okay? You aren't going to find it. The fox is already out of the hen house. Registration is designed to identify the fox before he goes into the hen house. Fraud litigation is obviously last resort. That's what the investor has to do after the fox has run off with the chickens. But those are the 2 basic prongs of state and federal securities law. Registration, which is basically disclosure, advanced disclosure, and prevention of fraud through litigation and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the first one because I'm going to assume you're not going to represent clients who you think are committing fraud. That's prohibited obviously by the Code of Professional Responsibility. You can't aid people in the deceit of others. Okay? And every month somebody in this country gets disbarred for trying to do that. But as I said last time, I'd run for the hills if my client even had a slight aroma of fraud. Because it affects your entire practice. It's not that one client you're helping. And could lead to the end of your practice. Okay, so those 2 regulatory prongs are the primary concerns. But startup businesses, as well as established businesses, also need help in avoiding that registration requirement, which is sort of curious. So the law sets up an advanced disclosure scheme, and then it provides exemptions where it's more or less practical to provide exemptions. It's amazing that almost 100 years ago, these guys were thinking about it. 90-something years ago. 80-something. Well, in any of 1933 to 2020, all that time ago, they were thinking, well, there ought to be an exemption if you and I start a company together. We know all there is to know about it. Why should there be a registration statement filed with the SEC to inform the only 2 investors who are the investors who in fact created the company? So 4A2 is the private placement exemption. And that's really helpful. Because you want to do what? Going public may be unnecessary as it involves the 2 of us, but it's very expensive. You got to do a lot of due diligence, hire accountants, lawyers, prepare generally accepted accounting principle financial statements and have them audited by an independent auditor. All that stuff gets to be really costly. And that's only the beginning, right? Because once you go public by filing this advanced disclosure with the SEC, this registration statement, that filing triggers the application of the entire Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which imposes periodic reporting requirements. Have to file a 10Q every quarter, 10K at the end of every year, and if there are lies in those documents, they're actionable. So both securities litigators and the SEC can sue the company if those documents turn out to be untrue. What else do you become subject to? This is a good overall view, and I don't know where else you'll get it unless you take my securities course. Some of you won't, but I want you to think about it. This is practical knowledge, and this is it. So the actual filing of a registration statement, going public, then subjects you to periodic reporting requirements. It also subjects you to the proxy rules, which means you have to file a proxy statement with the SEC before Remember, every year under state law, a company has to give notice of its shareholders meeting? And since there's so many shareholders in a publicly held, if it's just a normal company here in Louisville with 20 shareholders, you still have to send that notice under state law of an annual meeting for the election of directors. Again, state corporate law. All the federal securities laws do is say, okay, if you're a publicly held company, that notice has to be a bit more formal than the state requires, even though it's a state rule. We're going to require that disclosure documents called proxy statements be submitted in advance of that meeting to inform all the shareholders of the qualifications, among other things, of the qualifications of the directors who are up for re-election or for election. And it has to be filed with us, so it's accessible. That doesn't apply to 99.9% of the companies out here in the world, right? So none of this is almost irrelevant to 99.99% of the businesses in America. It only applies to those 16 public companies in Louisville, for example. It doesn't apply to Highland Cleaners, or the thousands of plumbing businesses, electrical businesses, car businesses. But of course, if you go to work for Young Brands, you're going to need to know all about periodic reporting and what additional requirements are imposed on publicly held companies. If you have an interview, you need to realize that you have this federal overlay on the top of corporate law. It says once you go public by filing a registration statement with the SEC, you're then subject to the reporting requirements, you're subject to the proxy rules, you're subject to the so-called tender offer rules, a number of Sarbanes-Oxley regulations, and the short swing profits rule. Everybody know what that is? Okay. So, you know, an officer or director of a publicly held company can't go out and sell stock, buy stock, and then sell it within 6 months and make a profit. And the reverse of that, they can't go out and try to avert losses within a 6-month period. And they have to file a form called Form 4 with the SEC every time they buy or sell stock in their own publicly held company. So again, that all applies, all that gets triggered by having a public offering. So he and I don't want to have that kind of, we don't want to deal with all that. We just want to raise $1 million for our business. And so we need to find an exemption from registration. So what are the choices? Well, I'm not going to take you through each one of them. There's an intrastate offering exemption, which is not too hard. You know, if the company's located in Kentucky and incorporated in Kentucky, located in Kentucky, you're only going to sell to Kentucky people, then theoretically you could avoid, there's an exemption, Rule 3A11 under the 33 Act, which is so-called intrastate exemption, 3A11. But guess what? There's not a corresponding state exemption. If you do an intrastate offering in Kentucky, there's a chance that you're still subject to state registration requirements. Okay, unless you can satisfy an exemption under the state securities law. There's a Kentucky Securities Act, which requires disclosure. And all those are cited at the end of your outline and summarized. What are your other options? You could do a Rule 504 exemption, which is limited to $1 million. Again, you get exempt from the federal statute, the 33 Act, requiring registration of all offers, but not state law. Rule 506 of Reg D has 2 exemptions. Okay, everybody needs to know this. This is not obscure. This is basic. So it's like knowing that 4A2 is the private placement exemption. 506, Rule 506 of Reg D breaks down Regulation D, which is an SEC rule adding exemptions under its rulemaking authority. There are 2, 506B and 506C. 506B, although denominated 506 period for years, decades, is now bifurcated. 506 is now bifurcated into 506B and 506C. 506B is the traditional one in essence, I was using practicing law 25 years ago. 506C is what's new. We're going to talk about that. And we also have regulation crowdfunding. Regulation CF. Before we get to CF, one thing about 506B and C exemptions, they both have been deemed by Congress as covered securities. And that term, covered securities, means the states, by definition, are preempted from requiring the issuers of those securities to register with the states. But again, as lawyers, we have to think a little bit more deeply about it, right? If I comply with 506B or C, can the state come after me, come after my client for failing to register? The fraud rules, the state fraud rules still apply. They're not preempted. What gets preempted by federal statute are securities issued pursuant to a Rule 506B or C exemption. Well, can I just claim that? Can I just write that on the subscription agreement or the contract for the purchase or sale of those securities? Can I just write that on there and I'm done? No, the case law that's built up around that says, you know, the party who claims the exemption has the burden of proving the availability of that exemption. So if the states try to impose registration statement requirements on you, or registration requirements, so you have to file a disclosure document with the state that looks a lot like a disclosure document you file on Form S1 with the SEC, they can come after you for failure to register. They can come after your client. So what are you going to say to your client? You're going to be really embarrassed, right, if they come after your client for a registration violation. In order to get, and registration violations are, not only they carry civil and criminal penalties, but it means everybody gets their money back who's invested. There's a 12A1 of the 33 Act gives it all the investors rescission rights. And that's usually worse than the state coming after you. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is that you are going to have to position yourself to prove to a state regulator that your 506 offering is indeed done in accordance with 506B or C. You can't just claim it. You got the burden of proof, and that's covered more extensively in the outline I've handed out to you this afternoon. And again, so 506B and 506C is covered, meaning as long as you actually meet and the requirements of those two exemptions, state registration requirements don't apply. They don't apply. And that has driven virtually all securities lawyers to use 506 instead of other available exemptions. And that's what I really mean by the regulatory vortex. There's one other one where the securities are deemed covered, which nevertheless is not being used. So let's think about that. That's the crowdfunding exemption I just mentioned. Came along in 2016. It's only been around 2 or 3 years. But think about the limits on this one. It permits issuers to offer and sell through something called registered funding portals or broker dealers up to $1 million a year without registration at the federal or state level. So they're covered securities too of a sort because preemption happens here. The issuer doesn't have to be concerned with whether the investments are insiders or outsiders, rich or poor, or smart or dumb. Doesn't matter. But the issuer has to file something called a Form C. It's sort of mini registration statement that imposes a considerable laundry list of mandatory disclosure items. The financial statements have to be prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, so that means it's going to be a little bit more costly. And except for the first year, they have to be audited. Except for the first crowdfunding issuance. The worst thing about it is that insiders, including their officers and directors, are subject to a strict liability regime for material misrepresentations in the form or in any written or oral communication to the investor. And you can't appreciate that until you're really out in practice, because if somebody has to prove your client intended to deceive them, which you do under the generic 10b-5, the anti-fraud provision of the 34 Act and the rule adopted by the SEC under that Act. Proving intent is hard. Got to prove reliance, intent, all these elements. But like the state remedy for securities fraud, it's not strict liability. It's strict liability. It's not. They're not a bunch of elements you have to come up with. It's strict liability. So the only substantive defense on your client's part is, I didn't know, and in the exercise of reasonable care could not have known it was untrue. Well, if you wrote it or you said it, what happens when you make statements that you just make up? But you don't know they're false. You just make them up. I'm just think. Just you have to go about as large. We have to go like 6 inches deeper than everybody else. So just think about it. What are you saying when you tell somebody else, this is the best product that's ever been on the market? It will cure hives. Or I really believe it will cure hives. It's the best product on the market, and I really believe it will cure hives. The person hearing that, and let's say later on, turns out that's not true. It's not only not the best product, it doesn't cure hives. The investors end up bringing a cause of action against the company, and the company's officer is also joined, since he or she's the one that actually made the statement. They all get sued for securities fraud. They can't stand up there, I didn't know. They can say it was just puffery, of some kind. But what else are they saying? Yeah.
But I've done my research, and this is, from all evidence, exactly what I'm saying it is.
Not quite that far, but almost. What they're saying is I have a reasonable basis. Having made reasonable inquiry, I have reasonable basis for making that statement. A reasonable basis in fact. All right, for those of you who had me for securities law, you know that question was on the exam. You got to have a reasonable basis in fact when you state an opinion. You can't just make it up. Unless you tell the client, hey, by the way, I'm making up this thing about hives. It cures hives. Just remember, I made that up. I have no basis for that. Then the people wouldn't have invested. So it's quite material, these opinions. And although it's so-called soft information, underneath that is a another representation, an implied representation. You can sue for breach of implied representation. Implied, so you have express representations, you got implied representations. And in any event, you can sue for common law fraud, for either one. Okay? So there's also statutory fraud remedies on the Uniform Securities Act in Kentucky and this crowdfunding provision, which impose strict liability. No proof of intent to deceive required. Okay. So back to 506B and C. So what I really wanted to acquaint you with is, all right, so 506B says you can sell to up to 35 non-accredited investors and an unlimited number of accredited investors. So you sort of need to walk around, once you start practicing, walking around thinking, all right, which of my clients are accredited investors? They might not want to tell you. But if they want to buy securities as accredited investors, they're going to need to at least self-certify that they meet those requirements. So what is self-certify? Self-certify means I certify that I'm worth $1 million. Or I certify that I've made 200 grand or more for the last 2 years and expect to this year. That makes me accredited. There are also businesses with over $5 million in assets. They're accredited. If you're an insider of the issuer, you're accredited. If you're an officer director. But 506B says you can sell not only to accredited investors, as that term is defined, and the SEC is now sort of trying to add some things to the dimensions of a credit investor, the definition. They recently put out some changes for comments. They're not huge, from my point of view. And they left these wealth categorizations the same. In other words, you're a credit investor if you're a millionaire, not counting the equity in your home, or you have this $200,000 of income a year. 506C says you can only sell to accredited investors. There can't be this 35 non-accredited investors. So in both cases, somehow you're going to have to figure out who's accredited and who isn't. So if I'm investing in Edge Analytics, Edge Analytics is going to send me a form. It can be the subscription agreement, or it can be a separate investor questionnaire. This is real life here. And what they'll say to me is, please state your name, your address, your occupation, and the number of shares you're interested in offering to purchase. Because it's not like you're signing a contract at this point. It has to be accepted by the company first. And please indicate whether you are an accredited investor is defined below. And so below will be you have $1 million net worth without including the equity in your home, your primary home. Second, you certify that you have $200,000 a year of income for the past 2 years and expect to in the current year. So when you sign that, it might look like a subscription agreement or purchase contract to buy the securities. It might also say how many shares do you want to buy. 500. You sign. I mean, you are certifying to, the company, Edge Analytics, that you are accredited. And that certification could be the basis of a lawsuit down the road if you're lying. So you're careful, the investor needs to be careful there. Because Edge Analytics wants an exemption for its offering. And if people are lying about whether they're accredited or not, that puts that offering in jeopardy and perhaps would lead to rescission rights on the part of the investors who did buy, not to mention trouble with the SEC. That's the practical summary of this. But guess what? The rule allows these people to self-certify. Unless you or me as the lawyers for Edge Analytics have information to the contrary, it's reasonable to rely on those certifications. I mean, circumstances might make it unreasonable to believe the self-certification, but typically we rely on the certification unless it's something we know is a hoax. Okay? So what's the difference of that between 506B and 506C? Well, an investor can self-certify under 506B, but there has to be independent verification of accreditation status to use 506C, where you can only sell to accredited investors. It has to be an independent verification. So just backing up, before we talk more about that, how many households in America satisfy this $200,000 a year or $1 million net worth requirement? How many households in America do you think are accredited investors, or led by a male or female who is an accredited investor, either perhaps jointly or individually? How many? As of 5 years ago, it was 10 million households. So if they're millionaires, 10 million, a lot of dollars out there. So 10 million. And I think they're barely wealthy, because at least based on what the SEC was trying to do way back in 1983. So 37 years ago, right? And the SEC passes this Rule 506 under the larger Regulation D. It said accredited means $1 million net worth. In today's dollars, million is 475 grand. And some, I think 80,000 a year income. So back then, in 1983, you actually had to be sort of rich. Comparatively speaking, that's no longer true. And yet, nobody's ever touched those wealth requirements in 37 years. And apparently, nobody has any plan to touch them, even though it's been argued they should be increased for decades. Back then, in 1983, that was real money, and it meant you probably could afford the risk of the investment in most circumstances. But now, the risk can be a lot more devastating since you're not really as wealthy now as you would have been back then with the same amount of money. Okay, so compare them again. Rule 506 exemptions, B and C, allow issuers to raise an unlimited amount of capital from an unlimited number of offerees. The major difference, 2, concerns sales to non-accredited investors, which you can't do under 506C, and the use of advertising and general solicitation. 506B allows no advertising, no general solicitation, which I said, I think, last time. You can't talk about it at the golf club. You can't talk about it at church. You can't talk about it at all, because talking things up is part of conditioning the market. And the SEC takes the position that conditioning the market is the same as an offer, even though that wouldn't be true under contract law. Okay? So what about these 35 non-accredited under 506B? Interestingly, they can't be just anybody, these non-accredited investors. They might be poor by the accreditation standards, but they have to be capable of evaluating the merits and risk of the investment. So if they're not, if you and I get an investor who we think is pretty crafty, pretty smart, but we're a little concerned about whether they are capable of evaluating the risk, namely, let's say the person is my 88-year-old uncle, then we might say, okay, yeah, it might be tricky down the road. Because remember, some plaintiff's lawyer down there, that's the thing about being a business lawyer, not a litigator. A business lawyer has to appreciate the risk of litigation, has to understand that there are people who only like to sue people. We're not that kind. We only like to build companies. But there are lawyers out there that like to sue, and they sometimes do it with real cause. They can be real substantive, right? A lot of lawsuits should be filed. But in our case, that other lawyer who's representing one of our investors needs his 50 grand or his 100 grand back desperately. So desperately, he's willing to pay that lawyer 35% of the 100 grand. 35 grand. To call our lawyer and say he wants his money back. And we think you didn't have a registration exemption because he says he didn't finish high school and he was incapable of understanding the risk or the merits of an investment in your guy's company. That's why when he and I are sitting around, whether we're the lawyers or the people founding this company or both, we're going to think to ourselves, you know, that guy probably ought to have his accountant with him when he makes the decision. Because the rule says either the non-accredited investor has to be capable of evaluating the risk, or he's got to have somebody with him called a purchaser representative who can make that evaluation. So it's probably a safer bet for us to go ahead and insist that that guy have a purchaser representative. And there's a form, there's an investor questionnaire which actually asks about accreditation. I mentioned a few minutes ago. There also might be a question if you, there's a separate section that talks about are you capable of evaluating the merits and risk of the investment, and if not, please list your purchaser representative or someone who will assist you in making a decision on this transaction. So we got forms everywhere in all this, and they're in all the form books. They won't be hard. Again, I'm just trying to give you the outline. So you don't have that problem with 506C, right? Because under 506C, there aren't any non-accredited investors. They all have to be accredited. But the advantage, in quotes, that 506 affords issuers is they can go out and generally solicit everybody. They can pick up a phone book and start cold calling people, presumably. They can run Sugar Bowl ads and Super Bowl ads, Facebook ads, infomercials, billboards. That's what 506C allows you to do. And the issuers don't have to have any pre-existing relationship with those offerees, those people who get those offers. Everybody who reads the billboard is an offeree, right? And think about that. So how many offerees do we have? Well, Professor Warren, you'd have to look at the 350 million people we have in the U.S. and subtract those people that can't read. You got 300 million readers. Well, yeah, but they also had to go down I-65 to Indiana and see that billboard, which I assume tens of thousands of people do every single day. So the whole country becomes a set of offerees, with the exception of those people who can neither read nor hear, I guess, or who can't make an investment decision at all because they're 2 weeks old. But it's a huge group. So that whole population base of the U.S. can be offerees in a 506C offering. Sounds good. Sounds good to a lot of lawyers out in Kentucky who haven't thought more deeply about it. Okay? It looks like 506, and the other thing we don't want to leave too quick, 506C allows unlimited sales to offers and sales to an unlimited number of verified accredited investors. So lawyers aren't real sure what verification means. There is guidance in both the regulatory, the final rule, that the SEC has provided about how you go ahead and do that. But what it means is there must be the verification process must permit the issuer to make an objective determination of the actual accreditation status of a would-be investor. This requires not only the investor to self-certify, but unlike 506B, where self-certification is good, you also have to review the investor's tax returns, bank and brokerage statements, appraisal reports if there's real estate involved, and so forth. So is that a barrier? Well, so I did this study a few years back, and it turns out that even 18 months, now a number of years since the adoption of 506C, most lawyers aren't using it, even though their clients would be able to advertise their private placements. So if we need our $1 million to start business or $2 million to start our business, 506C would allow us to sell to an unlimited number of accredited investors who not only self-certify, but who we can verify have the money. And we can raise as much capital as we want. So why aren't lawyers using it? So I had my ideas, but what started this was there are reports done by the SEC that actually quantify the data on the filings, because to perfect a Reg D exemption, you have to file a Form D, and it's just an information form. And the Form D tells what exemption you're relying on, okay? It tells you what, so you'll put down 506B on the form. It's the easiest form on earth to fill out, super easy, and the SEC itself never reads it. Well, then how can they come up with a quantification of the data? Because they do have some quants who go read it and put it into reports for statistical purposes. Okay? And some people don't file. Well, then that won't be part of the database. But the point is, of those that did, some 95% relied on 506B and not 506C. 95%. In terms of dollars, there's almost there's over $1 trillion worth of securities sold every year under Rule 506. Over $1 trillion worth, vastly exceeding the initial public offering market. Vastly exceeding what's raised in public offerings pursuant to registration statements. So over $1 trillion raised, and of that trillion, the last time I looked at the data, 97.5% was raised by issuers claiming the 506B exemption, which prohibits general solicitation. So when I got that data, I thought, why don't I just, figure out who does private placements, go through Martindale Hubble electronically, not the actual books, and figure out which lawyers out there hold themselves out in Martindale Hubble and other biographical materials as doing private placements. And we sent out, 400 or 500 questionnaires. And we got like a 17% response rate, which is pretty amazing. And we asked lawyers to identify, we listed some factors that might impact their decision whether to use. So we asked them, do you use 506C and 506B? Have you ever used 506C? If you hadn't used it, why not? That sort of questionnaire, but making it as simple as possible to check the box on, or is this factor interesting, like the fact that investors you have to verify the investor's net worth? Does that keep you from using it? And think about, why would that be a problem? I think if somebody calls me up and wants to sell, if Sean O'Leary called me up and said, I want you to buy 100 shares of Edge Analytics, and by the way, I need last year's tax return, I'd have laughed at him. You gotta be kidding me. I don't want to buy it that bad. I don't want other people, especially people that work for you. Louisville's a small town. Everybody on earth will know whether I'm rich or poor. If they hear I'm poor, they're not going to offer me anything ever. If they hear I'm rich, I'm going to get hit with everything you can imagine in Louisville, which I don't feel, including every charity. So it's not something you want widely known. That's why typically we don't talk a lot about what our net worth is. I did when I was a law student because it was an easy zero, right? It was actually in parentheses. But after you get out in life and you've paid your debts down a little and you're making good money, you don't want to tell people how much you make. You might be your partner, but probably not even your friends. So what are their reluctance factors? And before I leave verification, just a teeny little point, sort of icky, ticky little point about verification. The issuer to claim the 506C exemption, which allows you to advertise the offer. Let's say it turns out the guy is accredited. In fact, he's accredited. But you, as the issuer, didn't do the verification process, you lose the exemption. That's a little icky thing. I mean, just think, the SEC's taken the position you lose the exemption if you didn't actually verify the truth that is the truth. So process is important to the SEC. They hate 506C. Why do they do it then? Because Congress said they had to do it. There's a statute passed that required them to do it. And state regulators hate it anymore. We're going to come to that in a minute. So why are issuers reluctant to use 506C? Again, the exemption allows you to raise an unlimited amount of capital with no formal disclosure requirements and no pre-sale regulatory scrutiny by any state or federal agency. By offering to millions of offerees to attract purchases from hundreds of thousands of accredited investors. Okay, so here's my survey. What I call reluctance factors. Why people aren't using 506C? And by talking about this real briefly, you'll learn why we use 506B, why that's our preference. And you can ask Strench when he's here next week what his thoughts are. All right, first off is what I call best practices inertia. If you use 506B long enough and it works, just keep using it. Why take the risk of trying to utilize some regulation that doesn't have it hadn't been hardened and honed through use or litigation? So you're guessing a little bit. So this is a variation of the thing, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. 506B's work fine. 80% of the lawyer respondents to my poll affirmed that their issuer clients had access to adequate capital from accredited investors without any resort to solicitation of the general public. They didn't need advertising to find the money. And it's sort of a populist push out there now. Well, let's open up accredited investors to everybody, because what's really happening is the rich people are getting all the good deals and the poor aren't getting them. Well, it goes back to the origins of the securities laws, right? You really don't want the poor people getting the deals, and they're going to end up getting the worst deals. Because the really rich people, like David Jones Jr., they're not going to give their tax return to anybody. And you're going to be able to raise money from 40 David Joneses in Kentucky. You know? Or 40 John Schnatters in Kentucky. there are a lot of well-to-do people in Kentucky who meet the accredited investor definition. Anybody who makes 200 grand or more. So I'm saying there are a lot of educated, well-to-do people who can afford to lose money if they have to. But you start going to somebody whose life savings is 50 grand, you're trying to sell them a better mousetrap, and they're not really capable of evaluating the risk and the merits, and they're certainly not capable of sustaining that loss. And what are the most speculative securities out there? Those on which registration statements don't get filed, you know? It's where 90% of the fraud occurs in terms of measured litigation. So, first and foremost, there's adequate capital to fund your client's deals without dumbing the accredited investor definition down, and without going public, without actually doing a public-private placement, which is what 506C is. What's the other one? This was the most interesting to me. The lawyers tell me, my clients don't like offering securities to accredited strangers, as opposed to investors with whom either I or my client has pre-existing relationships. Most lawyers believe it's not beneficial to their clients to recruit anonymous investors. The underlying rationale is that strangers who become dissatisfied with their investment are much more likely to file lawsuits or to complain generally. So issuers like investors who they know and trust. Makes sense. We talked a little bit about this last time. Business clients conducting private placements should be really cautious about anonymous investors who have the money but have little experience in making money and losing money. Okay. So from an issuer's perspective, the prohibition against general solicitation actually helps them by providing a safer and more secure investor base. So it helps your client, the issuer, the company raising the money, because they don't want money from anonymous strangers who are likely to be litigious. Doesn't make any sense, so it protects them. From the investor perspective, this is the real subtle idea. From the investor's perspective, the issuer's need to use advertising to sell the deal should raise a flag, a red flag. And what's that red flag? That red flag is the frightening possibility that issuers are raising money from accredited strangers in this market of last resort, public, because their offerings have already been rejected by higher level traditional investors who actually are experienced in investing in privately placed securities. In other words, if I can sell to 5 people I know who are all multi-zillionaires, then why would I be out advertising with infomercials at 3 in the morning? Or putting my company's name on the side of buses saying, come buy securities from us, we're the next great thing. If your client's the next great thing, he's never going to buy advertising space on the side of a bus. You know? There are well-to-do people in the community who invest in these deals and lose money and make money in these deals, who virtually never file lawsuits, who are smart enough to either find you or you're smart enough to find them without going to the general public. Okay, so I want you to see that as a red flag. How could it be a red flag that somebody's doing a 506C offer? So if you go public, you're telling if you start publicly advertising, what's another reluctance factor? If you put your company's name on the side of the bus, what are you telling the community? They must be having a hard time raising money. You're also telling the community and all your competitors that you need to raise money to stay afloat. That's why you're out there doing it. So you're telling everybody, in a private placement, nobody knows you just raised $5 million. So if he and I get 18 people in a room and serve cocktails, only those people are going to know we're having the offer. And they're going to sign non-disclosure agreements when they walk through the door. So I protect the confidentiality of the whole deal by not doing 506C. you also want to keep the information away from regulators. And you think, what, are you trying to avoid the law? What are you trying to do here? No, I want you to think about this one too. By keeping it, because once you put the name of your company on the side of a bus, or in or Facebook commercials, who's going to see it? Everybody's going to see it, but who in particular is going to see it? The regulators are going to see it. And even though you're doing nothing wrong, the last thing you need is a regulator out doing an investigation while you're trying to get this thing off the ground. It's like throwing a wrench into the works of a legitimate deal. So you don't want what I call the regulatory spotlight on your client. I hate this thing. Oh, you've got nothing to hide, then tell everybody. Well, there are 1,000 reasons to hide information. From competitors, from thieves, and yes, even regulators, who in good faith might just be doing their job, but in the doing of their job, they're messing up your client. Because investigations take time and money, and often attorneys, and often accountants. Okay. And as the state regulators hate 506C, because they really care about the small guy out there, but for the most part, and I've worked with them for a long, long time. Most of the guys that go to work for state securities regulators are pretty people-oriented guys. They're out trying to protect the elderly especially, who are targeted a lot with bogus schemes. And uneducated people who also get to be targeted a lot. Uneducated with lots of money. They want a settlement in some PI suit. They inherited some money from a distant uncle. They sold the family farm. They don't necessarily, they're not capable of evaluating risk and merits, and crooks know that, and they get targeted. Okay, so you don't want to be in the regulatory spotlight through advertising and using an exemption the regulators don't like. The SEC's also talked about adding further exemption requirements to the 506C, so there's a regulatory overhang. That's what I call a regulatory overhang. An agency says, oh, we're going to adopt more stringent regulations next year. Then I back away from the table, right? There's an overhang. You don't know when that dagger's going to drop. The independent verification process that 506C requires, lawyers, 2/3 of the respondents said, we're not going to do that. 2/3. Our investors will not provide their tax returns, brokerage statements, or other confidential information to the issuer's management, their employees, and their attorneys, and their accountants. They don't want it out there. As I said earlier, they're probably wondering, why are these guys advertising? They couldn't get the good people under 506B, so they switched to 506C so they can advertise to everybody. Okay, so I've discovered none of those factors are really determinative, at least all the time, but taken collectively, they dissuade upwards of 80% of issuers and their counsel from using 506C. Okay, so that's it. Any questions about what I've talked about? Okay. Let's then go to our class schedule. And let me get see. All right, so Anita, do you have a partner?
Mm-hmm. Tia.
All right, so Anita and Tia. And what's your topic? It can be real general, by the way, for now, guys, and you can refine it later. I just want to get this on the road.
We want to do the 506C.
All right. The public-private placement.
Private placements under Rule 506C.
Okay. It's sometimes called a noisy private placement. Very good. You have a time you prefer? You wanna go early in the semester, in the middle, or? I know some people get really loaded down in the last part of the semester.
We don't have a preference.
What about February 4th?
Okay, yeah, we'll do that.
Okay. Check you off here. Okay, John?
Yeah. I'll do venture capital investments. I'm gonna work on myself.
Okay. VC investments?
Yeah.
Okay. Any date preference?
Can I do the week after spring break, so March 17th?
March 17th, yes. That's great, because Cottingham will be here to comment. And by the way, it really helps. You might think, oh, that'll make me nervous. You've got some outside guy coming in who's smarter, knows more about it than anybody in the room, and they're gonna be making comments on my presentation. It's almost as if you should be deliberately dumb when you make the presentation. If you've got somebody like that coming, you know, you've got questions because you've done your research, and they're open to all the questions you might have about your topic. So the comments will help you when you're out there actually representing clients. So it's sort of a real opportunity for you to get experience in advance from somebody who's like your future clients would be. And Cottingham will be a good one on that. All right, so that covers John. Austin Bates.
Yeah, I don't have a partner at this point.
What topic are you thinking about?
Valuation of businesses.
Great.
I was looking at February 11th.
That's fine. Anybody want to join Austin on that one?
Could we be a 3-person group?
Huh?
Could we be a 3-person group or no? Because
Is that the topic y'all chose?
that's what we were thinking of, but we didn't tell you yet.
Y'all
Oh,
did too?
it's a popular one. Everybody said
I'm fine to take angel investments or something else if that works for other people.
that.
So angel investments you're going to do?
Sure.
Okay.
You gotta do buy selling.
So what?
You wanna do this?
Okay, so let's decide. So, and you're firm on valuation, or are you thinking about some other things too?
We can do buy sell agreements.
Huh?
We can do buy sell agreements.
Right. Those are really practical and helpful. So
Sweet.
you are Adam and Dimitri.
Yes, sir.
Any particular day?
Just not first.
That's a great one. All right, so, tell you what, let me go ahead and get Macy. And who's your partner, Macy? Maggie. On valuation. Let me go ahead and put the teams together. That'll help me know how many weeks we have out here. So Sam,
Yes, sir. I'm with Seth here in the back.
check, Sam and Seth, what's your topic?
We're gonna do corporate dissolution process.
That'd be cool.
Which I guess can be seen as an exit strategy, right? I mean, that could be the plan. Because I invested in something a couple of years ago where the guy putting the deal together said, you know, I'm gonna invest in real estate, and it's gonna be different parts of the country, so forth. I'll take all this money in, your small part will be part of that, and I'll try to give you 5 or 6% return every year. But the truth is, after 5 to 7, I can't be precise, because I don't want to be locked in if market conditions change. I want a little bit of flexibility. 5 to 7, I liquidate. where everybody gets their money, all the property gets sold, hopefully you get your money back plus any appreciation in the property that was acquired during that period. So dissolution is a common exit strategy. So I want you guys to approach it as business people, not just telling them what the code says about dissolution. Because it ought to be a conversation as opposed to all your topics, same rule applies. You're trying to protect your client's interest, so you're talking about it from a business point of view. Because otherwise you lose, this is again, an opportunity to talk to clients with that, and talk in their language as opposed to our lawyer language, which runs clients off. Okay, so that's Sam and Seth, Taylor and Randy.
Yeah, we'd like to do exit strategies if possible.
And don't forget tag along and drag along rights. Just include that. Because you could be representing you're probably going to be representing the issuer who might like drag along rights and who might not like tag along. Because it really pertains to shareholders, right? Usually there's one big shareholder who technically could mess up everybody else, right? Real life, let's think of a real life example. Dimitri and I form a company. And a few years down the road, we get the rest of this class as accredited investors to invest $5 million in our deal. Ratchet forward another 5 years. And this can all happen in 2 years, but it happened a couple of times in 2 years with me. And other times 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So ratchet forward 5 more years. David Jones Jr. comes, he's formed a new company. He wants to take control of ours. We own 55% of the stock, Dimitri and I. The rest you guys bought for $5 million. All right, you say, well, that's not fair. Well, you don't know exactly what we've done to make it worth the $5 million that you paid us. Maybe it was worth 10. I mean, and that was the best deal we could get out of you guys. But the point is, David Jones is now saying we want to buy Dimitri and Professor Warren stock, and he's willing to pay $20 million for it. Why is he coming to us, not everybody? The obvious answer, right? We control the company. We have all the power. In fact, if we could have structured it so you guys got shares with no voting rights, or we got shares that have 10 voting rights a share and you have 1. All kinds of ways we could have managed control, but the truth is we control the company, and if we sell our shares to David, he will control, or his newly formed company will control the company that we created. Nothing's happened to you guys. It might even be good news, because you might think, though Dimitri and Warren didn't know that much about running this business anyway, now we got some smart people in, this is great. Or you could look at it a different way, right? You could say, isn't it something how Dimitri and Warren jumped ship after getting our $5 million? Was it some sort of pump and dump scheme? You know, pump it up, great company, and then we immediately dump after we get the dumb money. You don't know. But what you could do before you part with your $5 million is to say, you know, I want the possibility of tagging along if there's a change of control. Meaning David will have to buy my shares too. Just something to think about. Drag along is when you actually need 100%. David says, I want it all or nothing. If our company had drag along rights, we could drag those guys into the deal along behind us if we had majority control. They're just common little techniques, and not that many of them, but you'll pick them up as you practice. But it's like a toolkit. You know, let's throw that in there. And a lot of times, believe it or not, I mean, I did 70% of my office work was on behalf of companies raising money, but believe it or not, 30% was on behalf of people who had money who wanted to be protected before they've actually parted with their money. And in 50% of those cases, the people ignored my advice when they had invested anyway on the deals that I said don't look good to me. And it's being a smart aleck on my part to say, well, I was right. You know, I never told them that. I mean, they probably figured it out at some point. They were oil and gas deals, and sometimes people just strike you as being slick. Okay, so we don't have, so that's Taylor and Randy on exit strategies. So Ethan.
My partner is
Ethan. I don't think I've ever had two Ethans in the same class. All right. So what's your topic, Ethan?
We're going to talk about fiduciary responsibilities in family-owned corporations.
Now, would that be those would be just like Highland Cleaners. I mean, Michael Jones and his sister own it, and they run it, and their grandfather started it. That's one kind of family business. But you know, there's also, everybody familiar with family offices? You ever heard that term? A real important term, because you would love to represent a family office. So, I think I talked about my former brother-in-law who started, his dad jerked him out of law, threw him into sales. Ultimately, his daddy, who's getting very old, sells the construction company for a couple of billion. And my former brother-in-law got that billion, okay? Well, he was a lawyer, and then I guess a salesperson who was able to make presentations on big construction contracts. He had sort of an engineering background, but knows nothing about money management. But what he does know is that he can afford money management, and moreover, he knows that he doesn't need that $1 billion at all. I mean, everybody figures out that unless you're just crazy, 10, 15 million is more than enough for your life. If you want to buy a lot of yachts and stuff and jets, maybe you can run it up. But if you've got $1 billion, a jet's a drop in the bucket. It's hard to spend the income off $1 billion, even if it's invested in a utilities company that's throwing off 4%. It's hard to spend that 4%. So what do very wealthy families do? It doesn't have to be $1 billion. It can be $100 million or $50 million. Set up a family office for the management of those funds. And what that means is determining where your money should be invested going forward. It's not simply to say, okay, I'm going to throw it all in an S&P derivatives product, an index fund. Why would you do that? I mean, it's probably going to be okay, but family offices now are getting investment opportunities like BlackRock and all these big investment houses where they find deals and they create deals that are much more lucrative normally than what you or I could find. We're pretty much stuck with the stock market, except for the fact that I teach securities law and I've met these venture capitalists. I'd be stuck with the stock market. And most of us are, which goes up and down. The average over the last 40 years, it's returned, 5.5%, 6.5%. Not bad. 6% sounds, as you get older, really sounds great. It's like, God, there's little risk and 6%. That's pretty good. And you can get, if you can get 4 or 5 from a utility company, they'll never go under. If you don't live on the West Coast, like PG&E, then they're pretty secure. But these family officers investing in funds that buy motels across the street from the Mayo Clinic. They're buying warehouses, in Austin, Texas. All these investments where there's very little downside risk and some likely upside appreciation simply because everybody knows how the demographics are shifting in America. What states are growing? That's why census data is so important. What states are growing faster? Because if an area is growing fast, like I'll pick on Asheville, North Carolina 15, 20 years ago. If I'd had the capital, it's always if I'd had the money, but sometimes you have the money, you don't know where to put it. It's a lot of people's great problem, right? But if you have $1 million in 1995, and it still may be there, or 2000 or 2015, everybody's saying Asheville, North Carolina is growing. Well, if more people are moving there, the value of a limited amount of finite property is going to go up. It would take a disaster, an earthquake, or some what we call, systemic disaster to keep it from not going up. So there's certain areas, New York in the 70s, San Francisco still, as overpriced it is. Maybe the demographics are starting to shift. People tell me in the entrepreneur world they are. They're starting to shift away from San Francisco because none of the people working on a garage can afford to rent the garage. It's a really expensive place to start out. But there are a number of areas that are sort of targeted that we know are going to continue to grow. And when you think about the baby boom, the people born in the late 40s and 50s, they're all retiring now. Where are they going? They're not staying put in Louisville. I mean, Louisville's a pretty cold place, spend your last 10, 15. They're going to Florida, or they're going to Arizona, which are huge growth areas, right? So they're going to Charleston, South Carolina, they're going to other places. So you know where, if you could put the money, you might put the money, and these family offices, you may end up representing some family offices, which would be great work. And there are a lot more of them than you think. But it's a managed way of running. And then what else does it manage? It manages charitable contributions. So if I, working with the Red Cross, go to my brother-in-law's family office, say, hey, I'd like $1 million, my ex-brother-in-law, assuming we're on great terms, says, well, you know, I don't actually manage that. I've got a person that I've put in charge of charitable contribution. We've allocated, since I'm a good Christian, we've allocated 10%, a tithe, to charity. But there's a group of highly trained people who are in my office who deal with all that. And they'll give you an application, they'll discuss it with you, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, I don't have to deal with people who are asking for money all the time. So just remember that term, and if it comes up during an interview, it may be the lawyer says, you know, well, we represent several family offices, and it will be familiar to you. Okay, so who do I not have? And she's Kate Wilhite. And I'm assuming she's just, people know her, you think she's still in the class, I think. I may have gotten an email from her as to why she wasn't here. We got the attendance sheet. Did you already give it back to me?
Yes, sir. I thought I gave it back.
You may have. Yes, you did. All right, so who are we missing? We're missing Kate Wilhite, John Robinson, Donovan Gibbs, and Drew Childress. If any of you should see these people, please tell them to get in touch with me by email. It's to team and topic. Yeah.
I think John Robinson dropped the class last week.
Okay, so
Yeah, he had a conflict and another class opened up.
okay. Anybody know anything about Donovan or Drew or Kate? Okay. Well, it looks like those that are here certainly give first choices to topics and dates. So let's look at dates then. Adam and Dimitri.
Sorry.
Anybody while they're thinking, yeah,
Would
it's,
would the 25th of February be okay?
yes. 2:25. Okay, so that means I'm supposed to start on the 4th. We've got
So you want to do the 18th?
February 11th, what's
You want to do
taken?
the 18th? Or the,
February 18th is open. Bless you.
thank you, sir.
February 18th is open.
You want to do the 18th?
February 25th is taken.
March. Let's just do the 18th.
18th.
Sir, we can do the 18th if you like, of February.
18th, okay. Taylor and Randy, do you mind being on the 14th of April? Is that too late? No.
I was gonna ask for the 7th, but I guess we can do 14th, that doesn't work.
Well, I just think it'd be great for you to be talking about exit strategies with Sean O'Leary. You know, because I think you'll get a lot of information. It will sort of cue him up to talk to you about those things, which will be, I think, invaluable when you're actually practicing law. If you don't mind, if you save,
That's fine.
okay. Okay, who else is? Yeah.
Sam and Seth, is April 7th okay? Yeah. Is that okay? April 7th for the corporate dissolution process?
Say that again, April 7th
Yes, sir.
for dissolution, April 7th. Got it. Okay, Macy and Maggie,
Can you do March 3rd?
March. No. You know why? Breck wants the whole class. So let's see,
Could we do the 17th then? March.
that's already taken,
Um,
but you can still do it. Let's see if we got any completely empty days. March 24th.
we can do that.
I'm seeing if there, is there any empty day where we don't have a guest discussant? It doesn't look like we do. All right, so what day would you say you were willing to do?
March
24th, if it's available.
March 24th, yes. Macy and Maggie, March 24th. Okay, so let's see, again, have Kate, Donovan, and Drew get in touch with me, otherwise I'll try to find them. And see whether they're still in the class. I think Kate is, I'm not sure, John might not be, and I'm not sure about Donovan and Drew. Okay, so we've discussed the private placement exemption. You've got the outline that I told you I was going to give you, that I just sent to the members of the business law section of Kentucky Bar a couple of weeks ago. So if you see any errors, let me know. There's always a gremlin on every document, as you'll discover practicing law. Any questions about your presentations? And again, you know, if you do, just let me know. I'm available to discuss these with you. Just shoot me an email anytime. You can do your, if you, to the extent you're doing I see where 3 of you are doing, also doing meeting the graduation requirement for a written memo or paper. You can do it on your topic. You know, as I said last time, you can use the research of your partner as well as your own, you know, as long as the final product is yours. So any other questions? Everybody, yeah?
Just to clarify, it was 45 minutes for the presentation, 15 minutes saved for question and answer?
Yes.
That's roughly the point.
Yeah. Perfect. Perfect. Well, I will let you guys go. I will see you next time. Thanks. Maybe I can add one thing for you all.